In this video, we are going to show you some of the rare photos of Debbie Harry while also sharing little-known facts about her life story. Debbie Harry's life was nothing short of tragedy. From parents who didn't want her, being tied up and sexually assaulted with a knife to her head, being kidnapped by serial killer Ted Bundy, and losing all her money and her home when she needed it the most. We will share all of these stories with you and also show you some of her rare photos. With that said, let's get started. Debbie Harry was born on July 1st, 1945, and was raised by parents Richard and Kathy Harry. Her father was a salesman and her mother a housewife. She grew up in a migrant workers' house in the small town of Hawthorne. The family lived in a rundown neighborhood with broken shacks all around. At age 4, her parents told her something that no child her age can comprehend. They told her she was adopted. Her real name wasn't Debbie Harry, but in fact Angela Trimble, and her real parents didn't want her. They gave her up for adoption when she was just 3 months old. But there are more twists to her birth story. Her biological parents were madly in love, old flames who were apparently forced apart by their circumstances. When they reconnected again after several years, sparks flew wild. In the heat of their passion, Debbie, or Angela as they named her, was born. But there was only one problem. Debbie's mother did not know that her lover was living a completely separate secret life. He was actually married to someone else and had children. With a broken heart, she gave her baby up for adoption. At the time, being adopted did not bother Debbie. She was too young to understand. But later in life, it would have an everlasting impact on her and lead to a perpetual fear of abandonment. I guess somewhere in my subconscious, a scene was playing on a loop of a parent leaving me somewhere and never coming back, she once wrote. Even if she did want to find her biological parents, laws back then did not allow it. When later in life Debbie did finally try to locate them, she was told her real father had passed away, and her biological mother had no interest in meeting her. According to Debbie, the rest of her childhood was pretty normal. But nothing about Debbie Harry is normal. For instance, did you know she fell into a coma as a child as a result of pneumonia? And believe it or not, that was not the only time she had a close call with death. When she was 8, she experienced another frightening encounter. She was walking alone to the local swimming pool when a stranger exposed himself to her. Traumatized, she ran home and the police were called, but the man was never found. Debbie would later say how the predator had made her feel like a fly caught in a spider's web. Even though her adoptive parents raised her as their own, Debbie always felt out of place. As she wrote in her memoir, "I don't think I was ever truly comfortable. I felt different. I was always trying to fit in." She found escape in the nearby woods where she would often play, even though her parents warned her never to go there because it wasn't a safe place for a young girl. There were some scary folks skulking around in those bushes, her parents told her. Church was another escape for Debbie. Maybe not so much the gospel itself, but she loved singing in the church choir. At age 15, she dyed her hair blonde for the first time. In case you didn't know, she is actually a natural redhead. The inspiration for the blonde hair was none other than Marilyn Monroe. Sure, all girls wanted to be like Monroe, but Debbie felt a much deeper connection to her. She felt that, just like her, Marilyn Monroe was misunderstood and undervalued. During the most innocent time in her teenage life, Debbie found strength in Marilyn Monroe. Modeling herself after Monroe especially helped Debbie to overcome her frailties. More than that, however, Debbie even daydreamed that Marilyn was her real mother. In school, Debbie was a majorette and was even voted best-looking girl in her yearbook. But school was not something she liked, and she would often slip classes. After graduating, she wanted to attend art school to pursue her passion for painting, but her parents had other ideas. They sent her to Centenary College instead, which Debbie described as a place where young girls were being prepped for marriage and trained how to be housewives. She despised it. The idea of having the same idyllic life as her parents terrified her. "I felt like I had a split personality with half of the split missing, submerged, unexpressed, unreachable, and hidden." After college in 1965, she moved to New York's Lower East Side. She worked various random jobs, selling candles, being a go-go dancer, and being a secretary at the BBC, which she hated. She was also a waitress at Max's Kansas City, a popular nightclub at the time where the rich and the famous, from poets to musicians to politicians, would hang out. Then there was her stint as a Playboy bunny serving cocktails in one of their clubs. To this day, many Blondie fans find it controversial, and some even hypocritical. Why would a staunch feminist such as Debbie become a sex symbol in a place that was notorious for its misogyny? Well, the answer is simple. It was a good way to make money, and the economy at the time was dire. Plus, Debbie loved dressing up, and she loved a challenge. And don't forget, Debbie was a very sexual person by nature. Here's a fun fact. She once had a random quickie with a guy in a phone booth. That's the kind of sexual person she was. What appealed to her most of all about New York was the music scene. She immediately fell in love with the band, the New York Dolls, and sometimes even gave the band a ride in her car. She immersed herself in artists like the Velvet Underground. She loved the music of Janis Joplin. She tried to cut it as a musician, but with only minor success. She landed a gig as a backup player for the group, the National Uniphrenic Church and Bank. She later joined The Wind in the Willows, a psychedelic folk band where she sang backup vocals and played several instruments. The group released only one self-titled album in 1986 and ultimately broke up after failing to reach any significant success. Following the band's demise, Debbie moved back to her home state and fell in love with a painting contractor. But that love soon dwindled when the painter's true colors came out. He was violent, abusive, and controlling. When she finally broke up with him and moved back to the city, he harassed her nonstop. Thinking that Debbie was sleeping with another man, he broke into her apartment one night, held a gun to her head, and threatened to sexually molest her. Thankfully, he did not follow through with his threats, and Debbie was unharmed. She also did not seem too fazed about the ordeal. When asked about it years later, all she said was, "That was crazy, wasn't it?" And on a side note, here's some interesting trivia for you. The Blondie hit song, One Way or Another, is said to have been inspired by that incident. Anyways, in 1973, Debbie joined a girl group, the Stilettos. Even though the group had male musicians in the band, they were kept hidden in the back. The main focus was on the girl singers alone, and the men were never seen. It was after a Stilettos concert that Debbie first met Chris Stein, the man who would become her lover, music partner, and lifelong friend. Even though he attended the show with his then-girlfriend, Debbie was immediately drawn to him like a magnet. She fell in love with his long black hair and black eyeliner. It was a psychic connection, Debbie said. When their Stilettos bass guitarist left the band, Debbie jumped at the chance to have Chris join the band. He agreed, and soon after, both Debbie and Chris left the band to form a new band of their own. And so, in 1974, Blondie was born, and with it, Debbie's new persona as their frontwoman. The name Blondie was, of course, inspired by Marilyn Monroe and her platinum blonde hair, but also by a popular comic strip called Blondie, a story about a carefree blonde girl named Blondie Boop-a-Doop, who wore short skirts and bobbed hair and who had a bit of a rebellious side. Sounds a bit like Debbie, doesn't it? A third inspiration for the new band's name was how construction workers used to catcall Debbie, shouting at her, "Hey, Blondie!" Original members of the band were Debbie on vocals, Chris Stein on guitar, Billy O'Connor on drums, and Fred Smith on bass. Described at the time as a new wave band, Blondie certainly did make waves throughout the music scene and quickly gained a massive fan base. They played all the popular bars and clubs, including Max's Kansas City, where Debbie was once a waitress. In 1977, when Debbie was already in her early 30s, she finally got the break she had always dreamed of. Blondie released their first self-titled album with new members, drummer Clem Burke and keyboard player Jimmy Destry. The album was a success, but it did not come without some controversy, and it left Debbie furious at the record label. A poster for their single Ex-Offender featured Debbie in a see-through dress showing her breasts. Again, some people might think she's a hypocrite for being angry about it. After all, later in her career, she did not shy away from nudity at all, showing her breasts on movie screens and even posing completely nude in photo shoots. What made her furious was not so much that her breasts were showing in the poster, but that the label had lied to her about the picture they were going to use. As she explained in an interview, "Rock and roll and pop music are about sexuality, so I didn't have a problem with that. But they told me they were going to use the picture in a cropped format. That was the violation." And speaking of violation, Debbie survived a terrible and violent sexual assault during her time with Blondie. She and Chris, who were now in a serious relationship, were returning home one night when a man forced them into their apartment with a knife. He tied them both up before rummaging through their apartment, looking for drugs and things to steal. But apparently, he wanted something else too. He untied Debbie and told her to take off her pants. After having his way with her, he told her quite brutally to go clean herself, and he left with their guitars and some other items. The aftermath of that nightmare, however, tells us a lot about Debbie's sort of blasé attitude toward life. Something like that would scar most victims for life, but not Debbie. "I can't say that I felt a lot of fear," she said. She was angry and felt violated, but she was more upset about their guitars being stolen than she was about being violated. But that's the sort of reaction one can expect from her, always looking to the future rather than dwelling on the past. During the early 70s, Debbie had another close scrape with death. Remember serial killer Ted Bundy, who confessed to murdering at least 30 women? Many experts, however, believe his victims may have totaled more than 100, and Debbie Harry believes she was almost one of them. Picture this: late at night, alone, walking to a party, a handsome stranger pulls up to her in a white car. He offers her a ride, but at first, Debbie hesitates. What if it's not safe? But eventually she gives in and jumps into his car. If only she had listened to her instincts. The man had a horrible smell to him, but worse than that, she soon discovered that there was no door handle on her side. There was also no window winder, and the window was rolled up almost all the way. In fact, the entire inside of the car seemed to have been stripped out. One has to wonder, was it to leave no trace of a violent crime? Debbie found herself trapped in a car with a stranger. She managed to reach her arm through the small opening in the window and opened the door from the outside. Debbie's attempt to escape apparently angered the driver, and he made a vicious sharp turn which sent Debbie flying out of the car and hitting the road hard. As blasé as ever, Debbie simply got up, dusted herself off, and walked onto the party. It wasn't until years later that Debbie first read about Ted Bundy, but when she discovered how he operated and how he lured women into his car, she was sure it was him. Although many find her story hard to believe, simply on account that Ted Bundy was not in New York during that time, but Debbie is sure. It was Ted Bundy, and she almost died that night. But that was not even the craziest thing that happened to her. The Blondie days were wild days for Debbie. Lots of partying, lots of sex, lots of drugs, and lots of crazy stories, like the time the band were on tour with David Bowie and Iggy Pop. The two singers were looking to get high and ended up at Debbie's door. Somehow, David Bowie simply decided to expose himself to her. Most women would be shocked, but not Debbie. She was enthralled by David's pure size, and her only regret? That Iggy Pop did not also expose himself to her, because she was naturally curious to also see what Iggy was hiding in his pants. Anyways, in 1982, the band would come crashing down. Their album, The Hunter, was a failure. In an effort to regain their fame, the band went on tour with Duran Duran, but something was wrong with Chris. He kept collapsing on stage and was rapidly losing weight. Was it just the drugs, or was there something more sinister going on? It was Debbie who finally called it quits and said, "Enough is enough." The band broke up, and Chris spent 3 months in hospital. Finally, they had an answer. Chris was seriously ill with a rare autoimmune disease. Debbie stayed by his side and took care of him as best she could, which, in hindsight, was probably not the best idea. She plied him with drugs that she would sneak into the hospital, admitting that the doctors probably knew. But since it helped with his pain and kept him calm, she thinks the doctors just turned a blind eye. For years, Chris battled his illness and Debbie battled it with him. Due to his health and crippling medical bills, they lost everything. The IRS took their home, their cars, and even some of her clothes. In 1987, Debbie and Chris broke up. Their hardcore lifestyle had taken its toll on both of them. However, the two remain the closest of friends to this day. Debbie, however, was not ready to give up. She would do whatever it took to get back on her feet, even trying her hand at professional wrestling for a while. But she ultimately found great success as an actress, appearing in multiple movies and series throughout the years, right up until 2023. In 1999, after more than 15 years apart, Blondie reunited, but not without some strict demands from Debbie. The band was to be creative and fresh and new, and not an oldies band, as she put it. Since then, Blondie has released 5 more albums. If you ask Debbie Harry if there is anything she regrets in her life, her answer is simple. We all make mistakes, but the thing is to learn from them and make different mistakes. If you enjoyed this video, there's a good chance you'll also enjoy the one showing on your screen right now. Click, enjoy, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you on the next one.